What if you knew the exact date of the next major financial event? Well, today, we're digging into a pretty bold forecast from researcher Kevin L. Brown. He believes he's figured out not just what's coming for the global economy, but also, pretty precisely, when.
So here's the headline. The forecast is for a global financial liquidity reset. Okay, but what on earth does that actually mean? Well, think of it this way. Imagine all the plumbing that carries money around the world suddenly gets clogged and then has to be completely rerouted. We're talking about a change on that kind of scale. And this isn't some vague warning, sometime in the future. No, this forecast gets incredibly specific. It pinpoints a window between August 2027 and January 2028. And it gets even tighter, with the peak probability landing in one single week at the end of October. That's what makes this so different. It's testable. It's either going to happen or it's not.
Now, a prediction that specific just begs the question, right? Why? How could anyone come to such a confident conclusion? Well, that brings us right into our first section, taking a look at the incredible pressure that's building up in the system as we speak.
According to this analysis, the whole financial system is in what's called a late pressure phase. The best way to think about it is like a giant spring being wound up tighter and tighter and tighter. You just know that all that stored up energy has to be released eventually.
So where is all this pressure coming from? Well, it's really a combination of three major forces. First, you've got governments around the world racking up massive amounts of debt. Second, interest rates are way higher now, which makes paying off that debt so much harder. And third, central banks are actually pulling money out of the economy. It's a real triple whammy. And all of that adds up to this, a score of 30 out of 40 on something called the Structural Pressure Index. I mean, just look at the chart. Leverage, which is just a fancy word for debt, is at an 8 out of 10. Institutional rigidity, meaning the system can't bend, it can only break, is also at an 8. And liquidity constraints, well, that means cash is getting tight. Historically, a score this high is a huge warning sign that the system is getting close to its breaking point.
And this is where it gets really interesting, because there's this huge split between what we hear in the news and what the underlying data shows. The public story is all about economic resilience, strong job numbers, stable banks. But when you look at the structural indicators, you see a totally different picture. You see expanding debt, tightening liquidity, and a system that's getting more fragile by the day. There's a critical gap between perception and reality. Okay, so we've covered the why. There's a ton of pressure. But now for the how. How can anyone possibly predict when that pressure might be released? Let's move on and look at the methodology here, the three-phase pattern.
The method is called Triune Harmonic Dynamics, or THD. But honestly, the concept is really simple. Think about a forest. For a long time, it's healthy and stable. That's the base phase. Then you get a long drought and everything gets dry and fragile. That's the pressure phase. Finally, a single lightning strike hits and you get the integration phase, a forest fire that resets the whole system. THD applies that same simple three-step pattern to financial markets.
And this isn't just a theory, We've actually seen this pattern play out before. Just think back to the 1987 stock market crash, the liquidity crisis in 1998, and of course the big one, the global financial crisis in 2008. Each of these events followed a long, slow period of building pressure, exactly like the model describes.
So, if the system is like a giant dam, and we can see cracks forming under all this pressure, where is the single weakest point? Where is it most likely to break? Well, that's what we're going to get into now, identifying the market's fragile core.
And here it is. The analysis pinpoints the U.S. Treasury market as the system's most fragile spot. Now, you might be thinking, wait a minute, isn't that supposed to be the safest investment in the world? And you're right, it is. And that's exactly the problem. U.S. government bonds are the foundation of the entire global financial building. If that foundation cracks, the whole structure is in serious trouble.
So what would a crack actually look like? The forecast calls it a sovereign liquidity shock. Put simply, this is the moment when the U.S. government tries to borrow money to pay its bills, and not enough buyers show up. Can you imagine? The effects would be immediate. It could cause interest rates to spike overnight and trigger real panic in the crucial lending markets that banks rely on every single day.
All right, I know this all sounds pretty dramatic. So the next logical question is, what are the warning songs? Let's move to our final section and look at the real-world indicators you can actually keep an eye on.
These are the key signals to watch. Think of them as the tremors before the earthquake.
You'd see wild swings in bond prices, bigger and bigger gaps between what buyers are willing to pay and what sellers are asking, and signs that those overnight lending markets are starting to freeze up. And the biggest red flag of all? If you suddenly see central banks launching emergency liquidity operations, you know something is seriously wrong.
But hey, what if this is all wrong? This is a really important point because it shows this is a falsifiable prediction, not just some wild guess. The forecast would be wrong if we see government debt levels start to stabilize, if liquidity in the treasury market gets a lot better, or if central banks somehow find a permanent way to fix the system's plumbing. Those would be the signs of a return to stability. So this analysis from Kevin L. Brown presents a very clear, very testable, and very structural forecast. It's offering one possible future, a path that's being paved by all this pressure building up in the system, which really leaves us with one final critical question to think about. What would it take to actually prove it wrong?